Welcome to Conversations with the USA Racewalking Foundation. All right, welcome everybody. We're here tonight to continue our discussion from the USA Racewalking Foundation. And tonight we're going to talk about GOATs, the greatest of all time. And I'll start with one of our guests, Katie Burnett, who arguably could be the greatest of all time in the World Championships because she finished fourth. And we have Nick Christie, who's an Olympian and arguably the short-term GOAT, but the greatest of right now in American race walking. So thank you guys. You guys are going to be our panelists tonight. We've researched a bunch of people, and we really should start off and to say, you know, what do we mean by a GOAT, right? A GOAT is the greatest of all times. And while it's now used for just about everything, and we're throwing it on USA-based race walkers, and I'm going to apologize in advance for anyone in South America or Canada or Mexico if we drop the word American, but we do mean USA-based race walkers. But it really goes back to 1992 when the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali, and I'm not going to do an impersonation, was dubbed the GOAT of GOATs. And so for our discussion, really, we have to start with how do we look at race walking and call somebody a GOAT? So I've come up with a bunch of characteristics. I'm going to throw them to both Nick and Katie and get their opinions on what they think. Relatively, does one of these stats weigh more than the other? So the easiest way, and it would I don't think it would work well, but the easiest way to crown a GOAT would be to say who has the fastest time. So let's start with you, Katie. What do you think about using fastest time as a standard for being a GOAT?
Well, part of the problem is that the technique changed a few decades ago. And so people who walked under 4 hours for 50K, like the men who walked under 4 hours for 50K at the Olympics back in the 70s, say, that isn't the same as today because the technique was different. The rules were slightly different, I think. And now today, though, it still matters that we have people who break those barriers because they are significant. But it's all about, how do they compare to everyone else in the world? How are we doing within our country, and how does that compare to everywhere else? There's got to be more to it than just fastest time.
Sure. Nick, can you articulate what the rule changes were that Katie was alluding to that might precipitate the difference in technique, the difference in judging, and thus making it unequal to qualify? Kind of like in basketball, if you're looking at points scored and there used to not be a three-point line, how do you compare somebody from the generation before a three-point line to after the three-point line and just look at total points?
Yeah, so it's how loss of contact is perceived. So now we're, I think objectively from the work you've been doing, Jeff, and many others, there's much more flight time than there was, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, based on this recent work. But the loss of contact is a big one. And when you look at, say the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, you see a marked change in the style of walking. And that contributes heavily to, were we marchers or are we straight-legged runners, race walkers? How you look at the technique is a lot different, and how it's being judged is a lot different because of the style and how it's evolved. And even now you have a kind of different style forming. So, I'm sure you'll see even faster times as a result of that in the next 10 years, depending on how judging looks at the nature of walking.
Yeah, style constantly evolves. I was fortunate enough to start in the mid 80s when kind of the Mexican Revolution had already occurred. So I was never the marcher, but, more of, as you would say, a straight-legged runner. And my coach once said, you want to be as close to running as you can while still being in the rules and the definition of race walking. All right, so obviously we would look at a fastest time and look at that as some level of qualification. If we want to come up with something that is kind of universal through time, and even this has some issues, we could look at maybe how many Olympic teams did an athlete make? It's a little more problematic with the women because we didn't add the women's walk until 92 at the Olympics, but we can be looking at how many World Cups the women competed in. And even then you can only go back to the 70s and World Championships, et cetera. Nick, you want to start with this one? What do you think about using the number of Olympic teams or events? Because some people could double as a qualifier.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at just that, that's an indicator of a longevity that, you know, is certainly a characteristic of a GOAT, because can the greatest of all time just have been one performance? Because then we could look at people like George Bonig, who was the 1906 1500 meter Olympic champion, and then didn't really do much else walking wise after that gold medal. That was at the Berkeley Games, sort of Olympics, but you know, you could look at one performance like that, but like there's no length. So, you know, when you have a lot of Olympic teams, that means they were, you know, top 3 in the country for a significant number of time. When you have those 4-time Olympians, you know, that's a 16-year span, 12-year span. Like you have a lot of top finishes, and, you know, likely a lot of national champions in that span of a time period.
Katie, so I'm gonna pick on Nick and let you attack, and just say that I think it's simplistic just to look at Olympics, because back in the day, in the 50s and the 60s, there were no time standards.
Yeah.
And athletes like yourself and Nick, right, have a much higher burden to make the Olympic team than just finishing top 3. You want to address that and what it goes into, you know, as an athlete yourself, and what you think about today's generation of making an Olympics versus 30 or 40 years ago?
Well, there is that time standard, right? Like World Athletics, previously IAAF, set the standard. They would have an A standard. They might have a B standard where they would say only one person can go if you hit a B standard, but like multiple, like up to 3 can go on the A. And you know, it's these people in power, they're deciding here's a time that we think is going to make for a competitive field. This is about how many athletes we want, so we're going to put it at this number. Now that does make it more difficult for us, because then we're not just competing with, you know, the people in the US. We also have to look at, you know, what level, what time we need to get. And now it's even more difficult because they have changed the standard to be significantly faster, so that it fills about half the field, and the remaining half are chosen by world ranking. So then we really are comparing ourselves to the whole world and not just the US at that point, because, you know, it just changes the whole dynamics of making an Olympic team, making a world championship team. So we could argue that some people today could still be considered the GOAT without having made as many Olympic teams, but we'll see.
So would the argument be, I was just going to say this and you took the words out of my mouth, that maybe you have to weigh a modern Olympian and the number of times that they have made the team slightly heavier than the earlier walkers? Or would earlier walkers be stabbing at me right now and saying, you know, you're an elitist snob and only care about the modern walkers? So let's back it up then, right? So if we start and look at the number of Olympics you're at, and say that has changed because of the extra rules and requirements, what if we just looked at the total number of national championships within the US? Katie, you want to start with that one and give me your opinion? Is that a good barometer for a GOAT?
It is and it isn't, because if there's like a close number 2 constantly, and there's like some back and forth even, then that makes it more significant if someone's just so dominant for his whole, you know, amount of time. But if there was really no one else, then are those national championships weighed as heavily? Now, you could also argue that a national championship win is a national championship win, regardless of who shows up, because that person decided to race. And it is hard to race, you know, several national championships a year and perform at all of them. So it is a significant weight, I would say.
Okay, Nick, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the time period as well, you go back through some old Ohio race walkers and you'll see you have national championships from the 1 mile to the 75K to the 100K, every distance in between, 25 mile, 30 mile, 50K, every distance there's a national championship. Now, does that necessarily mean you're going to compete at all of them? No, but like in the recent years, we've had maybe 3 or 4, depending on what's going on. And especially in this kind of post-COVID world, it changes that dynamic a little bit. So there's a certain fluctuation that can happen with championships being hosted and the ability to actually win them. And then also the depth of the era. Like if you look at, say, Tim Seaman's national championship titles, he had to beat Kirk Clawson, Philip Dunn, Kevin Easler, some of the John Nunn, some of the fastest people in US history, like on the top 10 list. Whereas, maybe the times required to win older national championships aren't necessarily the same from that kind of standpoint.
It really highlights how difficult the GOAT conversation is.
Yeah.
I would say, when I was walking primarily in the 80s, when the depth of walkers was probably at the height in the USA, and there were a lot of national championships, and it was sort of expected that you went to many of them. Then there was a phase where I'm just focused on the Olympics and the World Championships, and I feel the elites sort of abandoned the lesser national championships, and it was easier for some people to pick up national championships. But it is what it is. So we've talked a lot about how, maybe it was easier in the olden days and harder now. So let's shift a little and say, should there be extra weight for athletes that broke a barrier? So a 6-minute mile at one point was a barrier. For the women, a 50-minute 10K was a barrier. Should somebody who was groundbreaking and so far ahead of their peers be weighed significantly more than some of the others? Nick, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I think if you kind of look too, that'll give you a glimpse of how great some of the older athletes were. Like Larry Young set the Olympic record or not the Olympic record, sorry, the US national 50K record in 4:26 and 67, I believe, at the Pan Am Games. But then he walks 4 hours in 1972 at the Olympics, and that time was still one of the best performers in American history for the 50K. Like a 4-hour 50K would make basically every Olympic team from 1972 on. So you can see how some of those barriers, when people are setting those records or going under certain times, especially like way back when, like Ron Laird going, 129, he would probably finish top 3 in most national championships throughout US history. So it does maybe showcase how good some of the older athletes were who broke those barriers. So I definitely think that's a huge component in being able to compare older generations to newer generations.
Okay, Katie, what do you think about that?
I mean, to be the first to do something, you're in a lot of ways, you're automatically considered a GOAT, when people think of the 4-minute mile and Roger Bannister, being the first to break that barrier, and then there was just a flood of people after him. But, people think of Bannister first with that,
Sure.
Significance.
Kind of like someone being the first American 50K walker in the women's World Championship. I'm just going to keep throwing that out there. So maybe 10 years from now, I'll have some other people on and we'll be talking about whether Nick and Katie should be added to the GOAT list. All right. So we don't really have a strong history of gold medalists at the Olympics and things like that, but you have to look at athletes who have gotten medals at international competitions. And so my question to you, Katie, is the gold the end all be all? If somebody gets a gold at the Olympics or a gold at the Pan Am Games or World Championships, does that outweigh multiple silver and bronze medals? Or, should we give consistent performing at the highest level that you've internationally competed and gotten more than one medal, significant weight compared to you just did it once and got a slightly higher medal?
I've actually had this conversation with a few friends of mine, some other race walkers. Like a lot of them are of the belief that you get one gold medal, that's worth more than like having even 20 bronze. Like because you're the ultimate, of that level of competition. I do though sometimes disagree because if you get multiple medals over several years, and you're also consistently performing, like think of like Jared Talent before he officially got his gold and he got upgraded to gold. Like I think a lot of people would consider him an all-time great at the world level.
Okay, let me interrupt you because you just hit my next topic, and we're gonna let Nick sit while we cover this one, and then we can go back to Nick. So when I think historically, and during my era, it was like Marco Ivaniak and Carl Schuler, and they went to LA and they scored really well in terms of place at an Olympics for a USA-based race walker. But the Russians weren't there because of doping, right? And so it brings up two questions. When you compare walkers of different eras, do you take into account that there was a boycott or something and certain countries weren't in the race? And do you also give some of the older walkers maybe a little more weight because there was no drug testing back then? And we all know that there's a strong history of certain countries and certain federations exploiting drugs. And there was a window where they were able to exploit drugs and not be detected. So a whole bunch of people like Jared Talent rightfully were moved up. Kirk Clawson, we'll talk about him in a bit, moved up because people were found out to violate drug policies and get thrown out of the results. So how would you factor that into our GOAT discussion?
Well, I think that goes along with what I was saying earlier about, national championships wins, and Nick also touched on this with it having to do with the depth behind that. So I think that would play into some of it, is if we're looking at, how much, like what level of competition it was at. But at the same time, I think about like my placement, and because of the late edition of the 50K in London in 2017, a lot of women just weren't even able to qualify. And it's like, those types of unfortunate situations. So if there's a boycott or something else, if the athletes still performed, the athletes did still perform.
So, somebody said on Facebook, a lot of people saw the post about the talk and decided they were going to have the talk on Facebook, right? And one of them, you can't have a GOAT conversation. It's too complicated. And, I don't think it's too complicated, but it certainly is very complicated. Nick, I'm going to roll into the next segment of our discussion, which is the Nick Christie show. All right. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes and I'm going to time it and then I'm cutting you off. All right. Because we know you could talk on this for like an hour. But we're going to focus on the mainstream walkers and compare them and not try to make this a 2-hour talk. So you have 5 minutes and someone said, who's Nick and Katie? They're too young to know everybody. And I said, oh, Nick has got a treasure trove of statistics. I would like you to highlight some of the esoteric winners. You've already talked about one of them. People who might not make the all-time GOAT list, but are worthy of discussion. And in the Jewish religion, we say someone hasn't really died if they're still remembered and still talked about. So we're going to keep these legends of race walking around because you've got 5 minutes and I'm going to say, go.
Okay, so we all know that the walk was first in the Olympics in the all-arounder. So do the all-arounder athletes who had to compete in an 80-yard walk in order to win their Olympic medals, which they did do, Adam Gunn and Truxton Hare. They won silver and bronze medals at the 1904 Olympics. I think they certainly deserve to be involved in this discussion. There's a very significant part of the history of the walks and its first Olympic debut. So they won medals and they had to walk to do it. So that's maybe their footnotes in the discussion, but they still had to walk to win a medal. And that's worthy of a greatest of all time discussion, I would say.
Sure.
And I've heard Dave McGovern touch on this before. We've had other Olympic medalists and say the 10,000 walk or the 3,000 walk in like the 20s. So, we had Joseph Perman and Richard Rimmer, who, both got silver and bronze medals in the 10,000 and 3,000 walks. So like that's another part of this discussion, like you can't just ignore some of these guys because they they don't necessarily fit the modern Olympic distances. And that is definitely a very large part of this discussion. And you go through and you kind of see that each era has somebody who like wins for maybe 5 to 10 years and they win a lot, maybe they win a lot of indoors or they win a lot of outdoors. And you'll see this on the women's and men's side where you just have somebody who's perpetually dominant and they collect a lot of titles and they go to a lot of teams. So you move forward to someone like Ernest Crosby. He goes from 1932, he makes the Olympic team. And then he makes his third Olympic team all the way in 1948. Like, I think if you can make, 3 Olympic teams over that long of a time span, you're certainly in the discussion for being the GOAT. And, that's the 3-time Olympian thing, right? Like we're talking, you made a lot of Olympic teams. You certainly did what had to be done on the day. And that's, the name of the game in the US for qualifying for these teams. You gotta make it. And you start to look and you'll see guys like Adolf Weinacker, another 3-time Olympian. He was breaking records in his era and he was, one of the fastest guys, makes 3 Olympic teams. And he won the 35K and some results that would still place him in our 35K nationals now. And he's doing like pure marching because he's walking in the 40s and like early 50s. So like that's a significant thing to look at when you see guys like Weinacker, John Nifton. I mean, John Nifton had that indoor 10,000 meter record it was one of the oldest records in USATF for a while until a couple of years ago. So like you get these guys from these eras and they were going fast times and they were going under I would consider it a more rigorous rule set. So you have to certainly take that into consideration in the talk. And
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. I would add that, the tracks in the early days were cinder, right? And the shoes were certainly not the super shoes of today, right? And at one point, like one judge could disqualify you. So yeah, there's a lot of factors adding to the mystique of what these guys did.
Yeah, and I think if you talk to some of the modern walkers, some people even yearn for like having that level of intensity and one card and you're out, especially when we move to 3 cards and you get a time penalty and you can still keep walking until you get a 4th card. That's a complete difference in the style of walking back then. But you keep going and you move forward. You have Henry Laskow. He wins like 10 years straight in indoor and outdoor.
Well, I'm going to pause you. If you're at Henry, we're at the modern era of people that we're going to discuss, and you did it in 4 minutes and 1 second. So bravo. So we paid good tribute to those that came before us. And Alex, you want to chime in and ask your question or a comment?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you hadn't touched on this topic of records yet, so maybe you were planning on doing it, but I was thinking about how would you rank, somebody's record haul? And I was thinking maybe the best metric would be not how many times did they set a record, but how many distances did they set a record in.
So we are going to going to hit that. And I thought from what you put in chat, you were going to allude to how many times they broke their own record kind of thing. And I think
that's a good one too.
I think that's manufactured. And I can say, I don't know about you, Katie, Nick, or Alex, that I was second to a world record in the 1500 when Tim Lewis crushed it. And he asked me to rabbit him, and I was like, "Oh no, God, no way!" Right? Because I was a very distant second. But we have the stats for a lot of the current elites on how many different distances they had a national record at, and we're absolutely going to cover that. So why don't we jump in? And I'm going to start with someone that was known as the Dean of American Racewalking. And let's see if I can do this right. And just go to Zoom, share screen. All right, there he is, Henry Laskow, the Dean of American Racewalking. Katie, what do you know about Henry?
Well, I mean, it's who our junior athlete of the year is named after. I believe, let's see.
You want me to help you out a little?
Yeah.
A little before your time. So, he was known as the Dean of American Race Walkers, and he had quite a colorful history because he escaped from a forced labor camp during World War II, came to America, became this amazing race walker. He is currently, I think, third on the all-time list for national championships. Is that right, Nick? At 43?
Tim Seaman would have passed him.
Right.
I think Tim has 48. Yeah, he's third.
So
He should be
we'll
number
talk about who has number one in a bit, but he's got
On the men's side, Maria has more.
On the
Sorry.
men's side, correct. I was just busting on Tim about that he's about to get dethroned. You want to take over for the Henry talk?
Oh, I mean, his biggest thing, he was undefeated in the US for like a 10-year span. It was like from the mile all the way up to the 20K, and he had every American record. Like he was the essence of dominance in the US for a good 10 years.
And this was like late 40s into the 50s. And back then he walked a 6:19 mile, which is, 6:19 today would have been second place at the Milrose Games, which, he obviously crushed back then.
Yeah, wasn't he also the second race walker inducted into the U.S. Track and Field Hall of Fame?
That's correct. So not like a race walking Hall of Fame, but the overall U.S. Track and Field Hall of Fame. So obviously people outside of the race walking community had great respect for him. On top of his national championships, he made 3 different Olympic teams from 48, 52, and 56. Really, for his time period, was second to nobody. And I even have one more picture. Oh, hang on. That's how small the pictures were back then. I believe that's at the Coney Island race in New York, where they walked from City Hall and finished on the boards.
Jeff, can I interject for a second? Can we also stop and appreciate what that photo looks like in terms of they're racing on the boards? They have a crowd that's on each side of them, just packed. Racing in front of a crowd like that, that's showing up too when people are looking.
Absolutely. And I've got a lot of pictures, not a lot, but relatively a nice collection of pictures from the Coney Island era. And there were people just lining the streets. It was definitely a different time for American race walking. So, oops, don't want that up. All right. Wait. We're experiencing technical difficulties. There's Monson. Woo, woo. All right, what happened to my collection of photos? There we go. All right. I don't know that I downloaded. Oh, there he is, Ron Laird. Okay. So let's go next to the guy who has the most national championships. Okay, Ron Laird. One of you guys want to talk about him?
So he was so World Team Champs, which used to have another name, the Lugano Cup. I think it was also the World Race Walking Cup at one point. But I mean, he had 2 top 3 performances there. And that's a pretty big race. Like for us, in some ways, it's bigger than World Champs for race walking because there's so much more depth. Your teams are bigger. There's more athletes there who are race walkers. It's a big event.
Let me add to that point. So you make a great thing that most people won't realize. So in an event like sprinting, having more people in the event doesn't really affect the US because we're tops in the sport. But an event like race walking, where we're not typically medalists and then you add 5 Russians and 3 Chinese or 5 Chinese who can all, in theory, our best walker, suddenly coming top 3 in the world, having that big of a depth of field is amazing.
He was also the first, he was the first American to break the 90-minute barrier for the 20K. And, back in 67, like that was a really fast time, because that's still the marching era. That's still where they have the old technique. They're not as much off the ground. He also was a gold medalist for Pan America it was at the Pan Am Games, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So what we can say about Ron is, first of all, he had duration.
Yeah.
Right. Because what was it? 65 national championships. Right. I mean, that dwarfs everybody, because 48 is the next best. When it mattered in international competition, he medaled. Right. And his PR was at the time was a 129.12. So he didn't just sneak under 130. Right. He crushed it. And that to me was like the 4-minute mile back then. Right. The only thing is, he did not perform well at the Olympics. So Nick, how would you weigh that he has all these great performances, but if you're a GOAT, don't you have to do well at the Olympics?
Well, I would also say he was a 4-time Olympian, and he did lead the US on 2 of his Olympic teams. So like that is significant. I mean, he finished, I think, top 20 in one of them. So like that's still not a slouch performance. In a good 7 some places ahead of the next American. So like, maybe he doesn't get top 3 like he did at the Lugano Cup, but he's still showing up to the Olympics, and he's not, getting 50th like I did.
I'd be very happy getting 50th just to put that out there. You have anything else to add, Katie?
well, it's hard, right? Because we like the whole US gauges the Olympics as like how you perform there, or even just making there is the most significant, is like the most significant thing you can do, the only thing that matters. But I mean, 65 national championships, like.
So I'm going to pause you on that. Mike, is that Mike Rohl who's hanging there? Is he going to talk to us? You can unmic. You can unmute Mike if you've got a mic. I don't know if Mike. Oh,
yeah, I got you. Sorry, I was typing.
That's okay. So you put something in chat that I know exactly what you're talking about. And that's how I realized that you were Mike Rohl, because it takes somebody with a historical knowledge to be able to pull this out. But Katie, what you might not appreciate in an era where there's Expedia and you just book a flight, and maybe a sugar daddy, sugar mommy, sugar uncle, as I like to call one of the people who help us out, provides us funding to get you at a race. Back then, like, there were no rules. Like it was really whatever your ingenuity was, and there was no greater GOAT at getting to races than Ron Laird, right, Mike?
Yeah, so a couple of the stories that I had heard, and I met Ron and competed against him early in my career as well. He was the national team coach in the early 80s. But it was not unusual for him to hitchhike to races. And one of the stories was he didn't have a place to stay, so he stayed at a farm. I think it was a national championship outside of Ohio. And so for staying at the farm and getting meals before the national championship, he split wood for them. So
we do have a modern equivalent of Ron Laird that Katie is very well aware of. We've not talked about this, but let me do my mental telepathy. Who am I thinking of, Katie?
Yes, the great Dan Sirianni, who had
slept in a cemetery the night before a race.
Well, and I have also had some wild stories and experiences getting to races. I, had poor planning. I slept in my car a couple times. Like a lot of us modern race walkers, because we're not sponsored, have had some unusual trip experiences. Like my first Melrose Games, I took a 19-hour train ride to get from Iowa to New York City. So,
but not in the cemetery. All right, we're gonna move on because this talk's definitely going to end up going long. And
do you have something to say, Nick?
I do actually.
Okay, go ahead before
when I was doing some research on actually San Diego, the Balboa Stadium, where Katie set what should have been a world record, world best.
Well, Wikipedia gives me the recognition.
Well, if Wikipedia says it, it's true. But don't tell Dave McGovern that because we had a disagreement.
So Katie set the 50,000 meter world best at the Balboa Stadium, and looking through some archives, I found Ron Laird actually raced on the Balboa Stadium track, some 60 years ago, and or 50 years ago, whatever, like a while back. And Katie actually, challenged a lot of his times that were then American records, which just shows, how much progress has been made in U.S. walking, especially from someone like Ron Laird, who has a 20K time that would be competitive with Americans now.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to move on for purposes of time. The great Larry Young is next up, and I'm just going to introduce him and say, I'm in awe for multiple reasons, including the fact that he is a incredibly accomplished sculptor, but has yet to make us a race walking sculpture to use for something. I'm just throwing that out there, Larry, if you're listening. But he is a two-time Olympic bronze medalist. And I don't know the answer to this, but I'm sure you do, Nick. Is he the only multiple Olympic USA-based race walking medalist?
Yes.
Yes. So that comes back to the, one gold back in 1904 or two bronzes in, the semi-modern era. Let me throw a few other stats out for you guys.
Well, Jeff, do you mind if I piggyback on that statement for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
So apparently, Larry Young, when he got his 68 bronze medal, they said it was a fluke. And he was so mad in 72, he apparently threw his bronze medal that he won in 72 on the desk in front of the USOC and the staff and everything, and said, "Is this a fluke too?" And
that's
really,
awesome.
really showed backed up that performance.
It's well, and not to give any credence to why they were saying it, but was 68 at altitude and in other adverse conditions?
Yes.
Am I recalling that correctly?
Mexico City altitude.
Yeah, so they may have been peeing on it for lots of reasons, but he also doubled at the Olympics, which is just to me an amazing feat. So in addition to the two bronze medals, he came in 10th at another Olympic Games, and he was also the gold medalist at the Pan Am Games, right? And no slouch when it came to longevity. In actually, he was a two-time gold medalist at the Pan Am Games, and then he had 27 national titles. So let's just, like, you guys do a little comparison. We've got three walkers from kind of vintage, not post-Mexican style race walking, right? How does Larry compare to the other two?
I put Larry ahead. I mean, those Olympic performances are just unbelievable. Like, I've also met Larry, so I might be a little biased. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I think also, having met Larry in 2014 and then hearing stories about him when I was actually training in Missouri, about this guy who would go out and train in, shorts and, negative temperatures back in the 60s and 70s. And people are like, oh man, that race walker was crazy. He was legendary from people that, lived in the Missouri, Columbia area, back then. So I think that's, his legend was not just in the race walk community, but also present there. And then you look at his, 4-hour 50K that he won a bronze medal with, and that still would make Olympic teams now, I mean, until they got rid of the 50K, but it would have made the Tokyo Olympic team, that's for sure. And
absolutely. So I'm going to throw somebody up right, that at one time was absolutely dominant in race walking, assuming my computer doesn't want to crawl up and die. That's lovely. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, there were those who know him as Papa Smurf. Tim Lewis. So, Tim had some of the fastest times. He was world record holder at all sorts of indoor races. He was an Olympian, but did not perform well. Not compared to some that we're talking about now. Should we be elevating Tim Lewis to the same stature as these other walkers?
Ooh, I would say so. I mean, I've heard of Tim Lewis. He had the 20K record, I think the area record for a long time, right?
So his fastest 20K was 1:21:48.
Yeah.
And more, I don't know if more impressive, but his mile time was 5:33, which stood for quite a long time until I think Bosworth broke it, right?
And it's still the American record. And I mean, anyone who gets a world record, that is significant, because you're not just the best out of the US, you're the best in the world. And that's our ultimate goal, right? Is to represent ourselves on the world scale. So I mean, I think even though he didn't perform as well at the Olympics, he's still up there. I would still rank him pretty highly.
Okay, now we're gonna have a tough choice, because when we're done with our talk, we're gonna do a poll. And I think YouTube polls only allow 5 people. So we could do one for the guys and one for the women. So I'm gonna roll to our next candidate here, Mr. Tim Seaman. And Tim did not have the, Olympic medals and such, but he had some other qualifications. And that really isn't what I wanted. There we go. All right. So Tim is second on the all-time list for national championships, although one of the women that we're going to talk about shortly is nipping at his toes. And he had 48 national titles. He was a 2-time Olympian, and with, I don't know, 1K to go, was in a step away from being a 3-time Olympian. And might this be a different discussion if he had notched one more Olympics? Nick, you were coached by him, so you want to start?
Yeah, I guess, if we're gonna go with coaching, that could be another part of this legacy, is that you probably don't have a good chunk of Olympians without Tim Seaman, and he was doing that still at the end of his career. He's coaching people. So
I'm gonna limit the discussion to the on-track performance, because we have too many variables to begin with. So if we start throwing in coaching, we have no idea what some of the other guys did as coaching. It's going to be a little too complicated. But Alex had brought up about the number of American records that somebody might have, and Tim was what, a 12-time national, 12 different distances for national records. And
Yeah.
how many does he still have? I put you on the spot. It's like 7, I think, that he's still holding on to.
I think.
Yeah, I think so. We got one of his last year, so slowly chipping away at him. But he's definitely made him some of the hardest records to get in the hardest era. We'll say hardest era. The fastest.
The era with the greatest depth at the highest level.
Yeah,
would be the way I would phrase it.
Yeah, there weren't necessarily the 10, 20 guys walking, decently well, but there were 4 or 5 guys.
4 or 5 that were capable of
very,
being
very
good in
good.
the 50K, right?
And
I think he was on at least 14 major international teams, depending on what you're calling the major teams, Pan Am Games, World Championships, World Cup, Olympics.
Well, and another thing with Tim is that not only did he win all those titles, but in the process, he was denying titles to people like Kirk Clawson and John Nunn for 15 years. John couldn't win an indoor title till Tim retired.
Sure. And
Yeah.
that's something to add. What did he win? Like 8 out of 9 or 9 out of 10 indoor
In a row.
titles in a row. Like he missed 1 year out of 10 years or something like that. Right. But I don't want us to ultimately say we think this person's better than that person. But what was missing was the international medals. So that brings us to one of the last guys that we were going to talk about on the list. And there are endless names like Carl Schuler, Marco Ivaniak, Jimmy Hiring that we could add to this list, but somewhere, we don't want this to be a 3-hour talk. We've got Kirk Clawson, and I'm just going to start out and say that, look at him wearing the Hershey's, that he finished third in the World Championships in what might have been one of the most brutal conditions ever. I think it was 105 or 106 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's a story about him hoping to take out Korsanowski because Korsanowski said something derogatory about his coach, and it became a blood match. And then Korsanowski, I don't know if he dropped out or got DQ'd, and there was Kurt up in the pack, ready to go. Katie, you want to add something about Kurt before we start rolling?
Well, he still holds, I think he still holds some American records today, right? The 40K and the 50K,
Sure.
The track 30K. He was like right up there with Tim for a long time. He still had about 23, I think, national championships, which in that era, like, to still be able to get that many is pretty significant.
And he bests Tim in one important stat. He was a 3-time Olympian.
Yes, that is
right.
true.
So
well, and he got a world championship bronze, in the 50K.
Absolutely. Nick, you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, he was a top 10 world championship performer. And, I don't know if anybody follows the world athletic scoring tables. They're a lot more significant in this new era because of the world ranking system. But Kirk Clawson actually has the highest scoring American record. So
That's that's one way to look at, best all-time performance, right?
Yeah, it is the strongest American record, by the numbers, according to World Athletics. So that's definitely got to be worth something. And that dominance at the 50K, 3-time Olympian, even how he made his first Olympic team. He wasn't the fastest guy in '96, and he beat all the other Americans to go to Atlanta in the 20K, including, Tim Seaman, some other guys. So like he was, he knew how to race, and he knew what to do to make that performance happen.
Sure. Mike's got his hand up. I already had my eye on you from chat. Mike would like to add a perspective on Kurt's performances. Mike?
Yeah, I was on that 99 team with him in the World Cup at Mazadan Deville when he walked that 347. And I want to tell you, it was probably the most, that was probably the greatest single performance, even better than his World Championship in Seville. Walking that morning was just unbelievable because it was the World Cup. It was at the time when the World Cups were the most represented across the world with the deepest fields. It was really prior to the time when they started cracking down on the Russians and the Chinese in terms of doping control, and he just handed it to them in that race.
That's fantastic.
Awesome.
All right. Before we leave the discussion of the men and go to the women, I just wanted to throw out a few names, not that we're going to vote on them, but just recognition of, I think we've covered most of the 3-time or more Olympians. So our 4-time Olympians included Marco Ivaniak and Carl Schuler. Dropping down to 3 Olympics, you add John Nunn, Philip Dunn, Jimmy Hiring. Then you go back to Bruce McDonald and 2 guys, Nick, that you mentioned earlier, Adolf Weinacker, and I think you mentioned Ernest Crosby at one point, right?
Yeah.
Right. So lots of people to consider, but we're almost at an hour already. So we're going to flip gears and we're going to switch to the women. Now, I will apologize for the women. It is a little more challenging getting some of the statistics, getting pictures. We're going to do this somewhat chronologically, and the first potential GOAT that when I wrote Race Walk Like a Champion 20 something years ago, that came up was someone at the time I really didn't know, because there wasn't an internet and there wasn't ways of just looking these things up other than Bowman's book of goodies that had every statistic in race walking. But Sue Braddock was certainly for quite a while the GOAT of women's race walking in the US. Nick, you want to throw anything out that you know about her?
Yeah, I mean, she was a dominant, national champion performer at indoors and outdoors. Like, she collected some eight or nine indoor titles in a row. Like,
I think it was eight out of 9, right?
8 out of 9, yeah. That's significant, especially because the women in that era, they didn't have the Olympic distances. So the 3,000, the mile, those were where it was at. So like you had to show up and you had to perform at that indoor, because that's where people competed. So.
And that brings out a really good point when we're comparing the older women to the newer women, or I should say the women of an earlier era. I don't think people want to be referred to as older, but there were many less national championship opportunities for women. So we didn't have the 20K, the 35K, the 50K, these longer distances. And so she had won 23 national championships. And I believe, Mike, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but at the time I wrote Race Walk Like a Champion, which would have been, I think, early 2000s, I think she still held on to having the most national titles for a woman. That has since changed dramatically, but she held on to that status for quite a while. And, as you pointed out, if the shorter distances were where it's at, she had an 8 or 9 year span, right, of complete and utter crushing dominance. So very, very impressive. Do not have a picture of the next contestant, and unfortunately my source for it, Gary Westerfield, if you're listening, is off doing a dog show. But Susan Lears, or Susan Lears Westerfield, depending on when you want to label her name, was a very early dominant women's race walker. And, when we talked earlier about women that broke certain barriers, she was the first 10K woman to break 50 minutes for a 10K. And at the time, that was highly significant. Nick or Katie, you guys want to add something for her?
Yeah. So, I mean, she had 2 top 10 finishes at the World Cup, one in 79 and one in 81. Those were both 5Ks, but then she went on to still make another team in 83 for the World Cup. And it was a 10K, but, she still had that longevity piece. I mean, breaking the 50-minute barriers now, we use that to judge like our junior women, because when they break 50 minutes, it's significant. So the fact that she was the first woman to do that, is a pretty cool thing.
And it really shows you how much technique and rule changes can affect the performances that we're seeing. Nick, you got anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that sums it up. I mean, she was also a fast miler. She was somebody who could get under 7 minutes. So like that's, working on a stat book right now with all the results. It's taken some time, but I think you're going to see that like sub 7 for the women, sub 6 for the men. Like that's a fairly exclusive club in US walking. So the fact that, someone could do that, and they could do that under, different style, different technique, different tracks, a lot of other factors. That's something significant for sure.
Cool. All right, let's move on to more of the 80s era, where our next contestants kind of came from. 80s, 90s, depending on how you want to look at it. And we'll look at Michelle Rohl. And, before we jump into talking about Michelle, she wasn't just a great race walker, she was a great runner. And when you want to just talk about longevity, not that we should factor this into the GOAT conversation, but I'm in awe that she is still shattering records as a Masters runner. And I'm just happy if I could be walking without pain. So, her career is so multifaceted. We're only going to talk about the walking side of it. Nick, as he stuffs his face, that's fine. One of the things about having elite athletes as guests is they're always eating. They're always refueling. So anyone listening and watching and thinks, the way to being fast is to starve yourself, it's not a healthy attitude at all. You've got to fuel your body. Nick, you want to start? And no pressure that, Mike is here listening and going to correct us if we get anything wrong. But I think we've done our homework on Michelle. So go for it.
Well, I think we first look at, she was a 3-time Olympian, and then she was a 3-time Olympian and she had to jump distances. And then she also beat somebody to make her third Olympic team who had won an Olympic gold medal back in '92. That's, just to make the US team, casual thing, because there's some citizenship changes. So I think that's a pretty significant, part of her story is 3-time Olympian, jumps from 10K to 20K, still dominates, sets the American records that last, quite a while. And, they take, one of the next people on this list to actually break them, and still not by a whole lot. So that is probably the start, if Katie wants to continue on that.
Well, I mean, she also had good international competitions. She was a 2-time medalist at the Pan Am Games, once a silver, once a bronze. Also was second in the Pan American Cup, which is another race walking competition. 4th at the Goodwill Games. I mean, and the fact that she held American records that were as short as 3K to as long as 30K, like that's dominance. That's really significant.
So I think what is, and you alluded to it statistically, but I think holistically you can say that when Michelle competed, she really focused on peaking at the international competitions. So even though she was, I think at the time, second to Sue in the number of national titles, which was 20, she had 22 to Susan's 23. When she went to international competitions, I think she was always the top American finisher. Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And that says a lot about consistency and how many of us, if I could just make the Olympics, right? It doesn't matter what I do at it. Well, I never made the Olympics, but we all had a target race, and then to qualify for something, it wasn't about qualifying for the races. It was peaking when it mattered, and when it mattered for her was international competition, not just to be there, not just to make 3 Olympic teams, but to perform well at 3 Olympic teams, to perform well at the World Championships, the Pan Am Games, all of these different competitions. Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, and another thing too, like those performances, like her 5,000 meter record is one of the top results when you look at the World Athletics scoring, like it's one of the best American records across the board. So that is, significant. That 2056 is quite fast. 2056, right, Mike? It's missing the hundredths, I think, but
Yeah,
that's one of the best.
That's the correct time.
And Mike keeps pointing out, and I was getting to it, Mike, you had no faith in me, man, that something that's also very impressive is that over Michelle's long career, there were many kind of pauses for having babies. And that just shows how strong she was over how long of a period when race walking was not her only focus. Some athletes today, they race walk and all they do is race walk and they have nothing else. And we're not going to add, at least I'm not adding into my GOAT comparison, like the next person we talk about who has quite a extensive career outside of race walking. I don't think we're factoring that in. Well, I'm not factoring that into my GOAT vote, but everybody gets to do what they want. And I lied, she's not the next one. She's the one after the next one, or 2. We have 2 more before that. All right, why don't we move on to actually two of our potential people are here. We've got Debbie Lawrence and Marianne Trellis, now Daniel. She obviously changed her name since she was an athlete. And I will say one thing about Marianne is she's still competing as a masters race walker, and she's a gold level IAAF judge. Again, I think we're talking about the greatest during your elite career, not beyond that. So, but let's talk about Debbie Lawrence first. Katie, you want to start the discussion?
Well, she was a 3-time Olympian.
Sure. And
And-
I just want to remind everybody that 1992 was the first Olympics. So when we say somebody made 3 Olympic teams, it's a good chunk of the number of Olympic teams, right?
Yeah, have there been 7 total? Or am I miscounting? No, 8. Hold on, 92, 12, 16, 21. There's been 8. There's only been 8 Olympics that the women have had a walk at.
That's amazing. Now I should be
And
mean.
they've never had 2 events at those Olympics either.
Yeah, so only one event. And it was the 10K up until 2000 where we got a 20K. But she did finish, so Debbie Lawrence did finish as high as 20th at one of her Olympics. And she still holds the US 3,000 meter indoor record. Hasn't been touched.
Wow, and that's what, 30 something years, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah, almost as long as I've been alive.
impressive. I was gonna play race walking game show and ask you to do the math on what percentage of Olympics Debbie Lawrence has been in.
3 out of 8. So
Now you see the hands going to the calculator under the table. All right, Nick, you want to add anything?
Yeah, she was also a Pan Am Cup, 3rd place finisher and a Pan Am Games medalist. So silver medalist. So like performed internationally, significant chunk in this discussion. So, and that 3,000 record, I mean, again, you're seeing some of the best, we've ever had, and they're not even touching it. Like not even getting close. Like that's how fast that record is. And it's still the area record. So, and she did that in the rounds actually at World Indoors when Race Walk was in World Indoors. So, really showing up. She did it on the largest stage. So I think that's a significant mark because the 3,000 was, a world indoor event in her era. So it's
Sure.
slightly carries more weight than maybe the 3,000 indoor championships do now.
Makes sense. All right, we're gonna flip to the person to her right and go with Marianne Trella / Daniel. She was of the same era, but she did not make any Olympic teams. That said, she had quite a number of international teams, including 4 World Cups, finishing as high as 16th. She was at the World Championships. She was at the Pan Am Games. And Nick, you were pointing out she at one point had a world best, I think, in the 1,500 meter.
Yeah. So she's, top of the line. I think it was 6:01 for the 1,500. So, quite significant, very competitive even now for the mile. Like that would.
So her mile PR was 6:31, and put it in perspective, the Millrose Games this year for the men were won in 6:15, I think. Give or take a second,
6:16 or something. Yeah.
right? So
6:12. No.
Anyway,
Yeah. Oh, it is. Get sidetracked.
it is getting up there. No, that is quick. That is very quick. The women, like we've gone under that some of the recent years at Millrose, but it's not every year.
And Mike, our maternity expert, points out that she also lost a number of years to maternity issues and whatnot. And while he says that she was a fierce competitor, I will tell you that I raced against her once and I thought she was going for a record. So I stepped out of the way and she yelled at me, "Don't you dare let me beat you." She was fantastic. All right. Our last woman on the list. Oh no, we have 2 women left on the list. We're gonna go with a modern one. You can tell the difference in the photos. Maria Michta-Coffey, and you could argue that it might be too early to put her on a GOAT list because her career isn't quite done yet. But she was a two-time Olympian. That is a dated image, so she does not have 42 national titles. She now has 46 national championships. And she's also been to 6 world championships on top of the Olympics. So she's been at a ton of international competitions. Katie, you've raced against her. What can you add?
I have come second to Maria so many times at so many national championships. Like she's been dominant since I started my elite career in 2010. And, you know, it's just, you know who the really good people are. Like, they're consistent, they show up, they want to compete, they're very competitive. On any given day that you have to be worried about them, even like, when she was coming back from, or when she first got pregnant, and then when she's coming back from being pregnant, still always going to respect Maria, because you just never know. She's a fierce competitor.
Sounds good. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, she's got 6 world championships to her name, and I think she's, right now she's set to make a 7th one. With their top 3 finished at the 35K this year. So
She
that's
also, sorry. Oh, she also, I think at one point held 7 American records. Now she has 5, but you're still looking at, it's like looking before. So her shortest one is the 2-mile indoor race walk, and her longest previously was the 30K on the road. But I mean, she still holds the 20K American record, which is the women's Olympic distance still.
Absolutely. So, career not done, still stuff to be written, but certainly has done enough to be in consideration. The last woman we're going to talk about, we've talked a lot of people with longevity, and she is the top of longevity, Teresa Vale. Teresa Vale was walking before I was walking, and still shows up, occasionally to some championships. And her signature move is, it doesn't matter who's in the race, she's in the lead, until she's not. But the Olympics were elusive for a while, but in 2004 she qualified to go to Athens, so she notched the Olympic mark in terms of being a GOAT. Katie, you want to add anything about her?
I mean, she's someone who I immediately thought we needed to add to our list. She was an indoor champion, like first in 84, and then the last time in 2008. Like,
So
that's
it's
an
24-year span.
24-year span.
Right.
That's unbelievable. And like,
and
they
those
were
times
both
were much different.
Yeah, they're like the times for the technique, but her time was still like pretty close. Like, I mean, it's just remarkable, right?
She had a very unique technique. I don't know that the technique changed in all that time either.
Yeah.
And when I think of her, I think of Jesus Angel Garcia. So when we have our international GOAT talk, how many Olympic teams did he make? Was it 7 or 8? I think he's the most Olympic teams of any athlete. Forget track and field, forget race walking, of any athlete. Super impressive. But back to Teresa. Nick, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, like Katie was saying, she walked her indoor national champion titles in almost exactly the same times. She was also second to Marianne one year in like 12:46, which again, that's I think the fastest second place ever at a national championship. So she was somebody who had such a long career and was facing each era's best athletes at some point, be it Michelle Rohl, be it Marianne, be it Debbie Lawrence, or Maria Michta. Like she was the driving force and somebody who was forcing all those other goats to, stay goat, right?
Step it up. Yeah, absolutely.
Who's
All
gonna
right.
be goat?
I think we've covered everybody that we wanted to cover. Alex, Mike, or Dan, you have any final comments? You can unmute and talk or put your camera on if you want. Or I will basically end the discussion and say, I'm going to have this recorded. I'll edit it a little bit, but not much. And then I'm going to create 2 polls in YouTube where people can vote, and we'll leave it open for about a week or so. And I mean, the poll can go on forever as far as I'm concerned, but I'll announce a GOAT winner after about a week. Dan, what do you got for us?
I've got nothing. You guys know it way more than I do. So
Oh, that's just a thumbs up. I thought you were doing
not
hand
the
raise.
thumbs up.
All right. Mike, you got anything?
Yeah, I just want to say I am super impressed with both Nick and Katie's knowledge and history, especially Nick, the history of this. You're rivaling my historical acumen in this area. And I was studying this stuff when I was, coming up through, had memorized Henry Laskow's top 10 times as a young high school athlete. So I'm impressed with the research that you guys have done. And I think this was a lot of fun listening to this. And some of the things, it's funny for me because some of the stuff that you're talking about, I witnessed. And we kind of talk about it now, but to have been there to see it. So when I tell you, Nick, that you're as athletic as anybody I ever see, understand I've seen a lot of these guys. And Katie, when I've said, that you're as strong and tough-minded as anybody I've seen, those are real assessments.
Awesome. I'm trying to do a talk a week and trying to keep the talks different and fresh. And so I don't want to say, hey, Nick, come and talk every week, right? People will be like, I'm tired of seeing Nick. So I really picked Nick and Katie because I thought they had that depth of knowledge. And I think importantly, a respect for the sport, right? It's not just about their era or their time or their accomplishments, but it's everybody's accomplishments. And that's, the GOAT of GOATs is really about, 100 and something years of race walking. I'm sorry, Nick, you didn't mention Edward Peyton Weston or any of those early 6-day walkers, right? But they deserve a little homage. So, all right. On that note, I'm going to wrap up, and we'll get this up tomorrow morning, and then we'll open the voting, and I'll send out an email, and I'll send out a blast to Facebook. And I've never done a YouTube poll before. I'm kind of curious to see what kind of interaction we get and engagement, which I'm hoping and expecting this will be way beyond anything that we've done so far. But how many race walkers are out there? So, we'll see. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Have a good night, and we'll catch up.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank
Bye.
you.